They go on to say it's important to note that psychological health occurs on a spectrum from mild psychological difficulties on one end to severe psychological disorders. So they're talking about everything from feeling stressed because of a certain situation to someone who is working with a mental health condition. The most common psychological health problems in the workplace are anxiety and depression. These conditions account for a large proportion of the negative impacts on employees and employers. Because remember, people's behaviors in the workplace and their well-being in the workplace affects everything around them. It affects their work, it affects their co-workers, it affects the organization's ability to deliver its mandate. So it's not just the individual's issue. Psychological health and safety in Canadian settings. Now, here's another example. This is what the Canadian Healthcare Association, so this is the group of all healthcare organizations who are members of the CHA. So there's a lot of corporate interests involved in this organization. So they talk about psychological health and safety. They say psychological health and safety is a growing priority, including Canadian healthcare settings. They recognize that 1 in 5 people will experience a mental health problem, and we know that from other research. Nearly half of all Canadians will have some form of mental illness by the time they turn 40. In 2013, Canada became the first country in the world to develop a voluntary standard on psychological health and safety in the workplace, and that's what I was showing you before. So again, this organization that is in the past involved itself in the past didn't involve itself very much at all with psychological health of its workers, is now saying, no, wait, we have to step up. This is a key issue. They go on to encourage health stakeholders to adopt and take action to implement the standards, to promote positive mental health, also recognizing it also contributes to productivity and economic prosperity, right? So for-profit and even non-for-profit organizations recognize the economic cost of psychological ill health amongst their workers. Mental health problems contribute to employee turnover. Nobody wants turnover in an organization. It takes a long time to retrain and get people up to speed. Absenteeism, it also contributes to presenteeism. That's where you're sitting there, but you're not really there, right? So you're not being productive. People are not receiving the benefit of your contribution, and lost productivity. 1 in 3 disability claims in Canada are related to mental illness, and the number is growing. Mental health claims represent 70% of the total cost of disability claims. Now, that's a huge, staggering number. And if nothing else, that's why we really need to be paying attention to this. This is partly because a person dealing with a mental health issue is likely to be off work much longer than someone who is dealing with another type of disability. So we're getting towards the end of this presentation. I'm just going to give you a little bit more information, and then this section will end, and then you'll come back to do section 2. So just to sum up a little bit more here, under existing legislation and existing health and safety legislation, employers have a legal obligation to maintain a healthy and safe work environment. Right? So health and safety, not just physical health and safety, but also psychological health and safety. Workplace practices that create the risk of mental injury can therefore lead to legal liability, and that's what organizations and other policy-making stakeholders are waking up to. Healthcare workers, now here's where we're getting right into healthcare workers, are 1.5 times more likely to be off work due to illness or disability than people in all other sectors. So providing healthcare, like you do as an occupational therapist, takes a huge toll on your own health. We're very good at helping other people with their health issues. We tend to neglect our own. What do they say about the shoemaker's children, right? They all go barefoot, and that's sort of how OTs fit right in there. We don't look after ourselves very well. So there's an organization that's called Not Myself Today. and they look at psychological health in the workplace. They're about awareness. It's actually a charity. They seek donations from corporations, from large corporations, to support their work, and then they provide all kinds of different resources. So I'm going to ask you to pause the presentation here again and go to their website. They have what's called a mini toolkit for individuals, and there's a wonderful thing there you can do to send a positive IOU to someone, just to unexpectedly give them a little bit of a moment to smile in their day, to help make their day a little bit more psychologically healthy. And at the end of that, or on the same page, you'll see a link to the stress index test. And if you want to take that too for your own insight, you might want to take a look at that. Then when you've finished with that page, because I know when I got onto those IOUs, I started sending them to about 20 different people. So I got kind of carried away. But anyway, when you're done with that, return to the presentation. Maybe have a little stretch, get yourself a cup of tea. And we've just got a few more slides to bring this home to occupational therapy. And then that will be the end of part 1. Okay, so you've sent your IOUs, you've maybe taken a stress test, you've got a cup of tea, so you're feeling hydrated. All is good. I want to just briefly mention something about stress and burnout. Not all stress is bad. Research shows us that novel stressors actually are good for us. They help us to be flexible and more creative. So things like in class, when something comes up that's really novel and you're not expecting it and everything, it helps you actually to learn more. It helps you to be more creative and to keep your engagement, your motivation up. It's chronic stress that's the problem, right? That's what takes that large physiological and emotional toll. And so there's a related concept, burnout. We hear a lot about burnout in individuals and healthcare workers. And that's defined as a state. Actually, Freudenberger was the first person to coin this term back in 1974, which to you might seem like a long time ago, but was just when I was starting to contemplate a career in healthcare. Before that, we'd never heard of burnout. And burnout is defined as a state of emotional exhaustion brought about by overwork, resulting in progressive deterioration of ability to carry out one's responsibility. And it's related to work. It's about your workplace. It's not about burnout at home. It's not the same thing as depression or anxiety. Okay? It's work related. Many healthcare workers have heavy workloads, significant pressures, and a lack of time and resources to adequately do their jobs. Staff shortages as a result of cutbacks and layoffs are common and can lead to longer or more frequent working periods and increase in personal stress. Just talk to the people when you're on placement. What happens when somebody goes on maternity leave or a position, someone resigns or retires? Does the position get filled right away? In addition to doing more with less, which is a perpetual message now, work in the healthcare sector can be emotionally demanding. And you saw that when you were on placement. Ongoing work with patients and their families and helping people cope with illness and death can result in what's called compassion fatigue. Really, you are getting emotionally involved with people, and you have to have some way to maintain your own resiliency and your own compassion. And cumulatively, it takes a huge toll. Healthcare workers can also face challenges associated with shift work. Now, we don't have a lot of shift work, but we do experience workplace violence and bullying. And we certainly, as occupational therapists, deal with rapidly changing practice environments. One thing, if you want to find out a little more about compassion fatigue, I'm going to give you it's in your course pack, the link to the OT fatigue website that SAOT posted just recently. There's a whole section there. One of the students did a little video clip and a handout about compassion fatigue. So you can go take a look at that. Okay, so that all sounds kind of overwhelming, and it's not really OT, right? Some of you are still not convinced, I suspect. But no, sorry, you're wrong. And actually, there is starting to be more emerging literature, which is a good thing, where OTs are looking at ourselves. We're holding that mirror up and looking at us instead of what can we do for our clients. Because if we're not healthy practitioners, we are not going to help our clients at all. So there's a growing number of studies out there, some of the more recent ones about enhancing retention because of OTs who are working with mental health conditions. What's the experience of burnout like? This is a Canadian study, the one by Gupta. And then what's the impact of high job demands and lack of time, and how are we going to manage all of that sort of stuff? So those are just a few examples, but there's some common themes that come out of them. The themes are time, which makes sense, resources, superficial work. Now that's a little different, right? People felt that their work was being, because of time constraints, forced to be more and more superficial, so that they couldn't actually do a good job. They couldn't do the job that they knew they should. They were just skating the surface. There was a lack of personal satisfaction. People felt they weren't respected for the work that they did, and that there was an increasing lack of home and work boundaries, that people, employers and organizations increasingly expected you to be available on the phone or to be working on reports or doing things that outside of work hours. Some of the other themes were people feeling less engaged in their job, and that they were working in cultures where everybody else seemed to say yes to everything, and that it was not okay to ever say, no, I'm sorry, I can't. And that was incredibly stressful and isolating. So people felt that they were alone when they said, no, this is unrealistic, or this is more than I can cope with, because everybody else was stretching like crazy to try and do it. And it does tend to be an OT habit to stretch. And just when you're having a little talk amongst your friends or with your family or in your head, have a little talk about who are we helping when we stretch, and is that actually, that short term, actually going to be effective, and what are the consequences? Okay, a couple more slides, then we're done with this section. Excuse me. So some of the burnout issues that Gupta identified, we already talked about those: time, conflict, a mismatch of the OT's values with the organization, lack of resources, a perceived lack of respect, that people always felt they had to justify as an OT what they were doing, why they were doing it, or that they were being pushed to do something they felt wasn't part of their domain, but they had to because the rest of the team wanted them to, but then to the exclusion of something that would have been much more occupationally focused. And that people felt they had a lack of autonomy and they weren't able to customize their practice around clients' particular individual needs, and that there was a lot of policy and procedure that prevented them from being able to offer the best service in a more flexible way. So their study looked at what OTs thought were barriers, and then they also looked at coping strategies. And I just want you to take note. Well, first, let's look at these coping strategies. Okay, so things about boundaries, trying to maintain home work boundaries, negotiating workloads, surrounding yourself with supportive family and friends and colleagues, monitoring yourself, making sure that you were pacing yourself and keeping physically fit and getting lots of rest and all those things, and then focusing on what was satisfying in the workplace. So those are all very well and good, but what I would suggest to you is that the coping strategies don't involve anybody else. Apparently, OTs are responsible for dealing with burnout all on their own, if you just follow this. There's nothing in here about approaching your union to advocate on your behalf, or your professional association, or your manager. There's nothing here about what the organization's responsibilities are. So we're going to talk much more about that later on. But just to say, this is interesting research, but it also, I think, leaves people with a feeling that it is their job. And if they don't keep physically fit and they don't get to bed at 10:30 at night, it's their own fault that they're burnt out. And that's the last thing we need, right? We're not about making fault, assigning blame. This is about a problem exists. It's very complex. It has many, many features that impact it. And so we have to make sure that everyone is contributing to the resolution and the prevention. Okay, here's another study that was done by Painter. Now, this is a while ago, 2003. They used Maslach's burnout inventory, so the MBI, which divides burnout into emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal accomplishment. And low scores on emotional exhaustion are a good thing, right? It means that you're feeling quite restored. High scores on depersonalization are not good. That means depersonalization means that you feel quite distant from your clients, you don't identify with them, you don't empathize as well, right? So you don't want high depersonalization. And the OTs in this study, they were very low, 4.2. So they still had a strong connection with their clients. And they also had quite strong feelings of personal accomplishment. So even though they were pretty high on emotional exhaustion, the engagement with their client, that connection, and their feelings of personal accomplishment were actually quite protective. It helped them manage better. Okay, but at what cost, right? So we all just have to take this into consideration. So, and there's other studies where they found similar things. One of the things that OTs always seem to do quite well with is keeping our depersonalization low and feeling that we have accomplished quite well. So these a 2004 study in Australia found the same thing. Now I'm going to show you some data from a recent survey that SAOT did here in Alberta. And their sample, if you look at the table, and you might want to pause the presentation and just look at the table a little bit because it's quite complicated. But SAOT did a survey of 143 people responded, and they were therapists from across the province with all kinds of different caseloads. We looked at their Maslach burnout inventory scores, emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal accomplishments, okay, and compared them to other organizations. Now, what was different was that OTs in Alberta, at least the ones who participated in this survey, so there's about 2,000 OTs in the province, and there's only 143 who responded, so it's not representative by any stretch. But the OTs who responded were quite low on emotional exhaustion. They were okay. They were not nearly as exhausted as the other OTs reported in these studies. But their depersonalization was also quite high compared to some of the other OT studies, right? So a score of 9 compared to 5, 7, 4, 7, 6, so maybe the two are interacting in some way, we don't know. And then finally, personal accomplishment. Personal accomplishment was very high in the OTs who replied to this. So the profile we get of these people is that they're not feeling particularly exhausted, but they're feeling distant and disengaged with their clients and other people around them. So they're depersonalizing, but they feel quite strong in their achievement. And what I'm going to, just a second here, we'll click to the next slide. Okay. So we did some reports based on those surveys, and we didn't just look at burnout. We also looked at work engagement and also an assessment tool for work addiction. And there are 3 reports that I've posted on eClass, and you can take a look at those. I'd like you to pause the presentation here, go look at those draft reports because there's some analysis and interpretation, and your thoughts are very welcome on this. And this is going to be the end of part 1. So when you come back to the rest of the lecture, go into part 2, and then we'll finish the lecture for the morning. And great, now I'm going to go have a glass of water. It was a lot of talking.